Hello, this is Karen Squires, independent Stampin' Up! Demonstrator with Stampin' by the Bay. Today we're going to make this lattice card using the Lots of Labels frame lens. I originally saw this idea from Linda Baldwin's blog with Stampin' with Linda at TypePad. She had shown a sample of using the Lots of Labels with a lattice. Right now I'm using Lots of Labels, the two largest labels, and the Whisper White cardstock, which is 3.5 by 5.5, and I run that through the Big Shot to get your frame. And I line up the frame on my grid paper, make sure it's evenly spaced, and I tape it down with some post-it note tape. And this tape is 1/8 of an inch thick. And I just want to hold it steady because I'm going to be touching this a lot, and I really want to make sure that the strips of paper that I apply to this frame is even. And I use 1/8 inch strips of Whisper White. This is a great way to use up some of those scraps. And I start from one corner of the framelit and I go diagonally to the other corner of the framelit, cut off any excess, and I continue this. And I usually use, I guess it's about a square apart when I lay them out. But I like using the grid paper because, once you figure out how it's laid down and you can figure out how evenly spaced you want to use it. Once I fill up the lattice going one way, I continue the same pattern going over the opposite way. Once the lattice is attached, I carefully lift it up and I remove the tape. Using my paper snips, I trim off the excess pieces. Sorry I'm off the screen a little. Put the lattice aside. Next, I use the Whisper White thick 100-pound paper. This is new in the catalog. It's 4 1/4 by 11 inches, scored at 5.5 inches. This Whisper White paper is thick and I do like it. I use the corner rounder to round the bottom edges of the card. I do use an insert for this card. Like I said, the cardstock is thick, but I find that the top of it is kind of heavy, so I need to have another insert on the back, and I think it helps it stand and it's a little bit more stable. Inside piece does not need to be matted, so it's just 5 3/8 by 4 1/4. Next, I take my piece of Sahara sand, ran through the brick wall embossing folder. It's 1.5 inches by 5 3/8, and the Blushing Bride piece of 1 inch by 5 3/8. Using my scallop trim edge border punch, it is retired. Whenever I use a border punch, I take my paper and I put it in the middle of my punch, so it's spaced. So my first punch is in the middle. I punch, I move it over to the other side, I punch again, and then I move it back to the opposite side and I punch. This is the way that I find that I can get an even scallops through that piece of paper. You don't have half of a scallop on one end and a quarter of a scallop or a whole scallop on the other end. Next, I use my 1/2 inch quarter rounder and I round this one side of the Sahara sand. I attach these two pieces together and then I attach them inside the card. Using my piece of fun foam, which is 3 by 7/8 of an inch by 5 1/8 of an inch, I round again the edges of the bottom of it with a 1/2 inch corner round. Then I take my piece of Sahara sand, which has been run through the brick wall embossing folder, which is 4 1/8 of an inch by 5 3/8. I attach this fun foam to the back of the Sahara sand piece of paper, and then I attach this to the card front. Next, I take my 1/4 of an inch Blushing Bride cotton ribbon and I tie it around from the inside of the card to the front. And I just tie a simple knot. Next, using the mini glue dots, I use that to attach the lattice to the card front. I put a dot in the four corners of the lattice, in the very top and the bottom, in the center, on the sides. Sorry, I kind of went off the screen and you can't see, but once this is attached, I get my scraps of pear pizzazz and my Big Shot, and I have my little leaves die, and I run through two. I need two of those little leaves. And then I use my pear pizzazz scrap of paper and my bird builder punch, and I punch out two branches. I lay the branches and the leaves on the lattice to figure out how I want the placement of it. I did trim on one of those branches down. Next, I use my mini glue pen and I attach this to the front of the lattice. After the leaves and branches are attached, I grab my itty bitty accent punch with the flower and my paper piercing mat, scraps of Perfect Plum and Blushing Bride. I get about 5 or 6 flowers for each color. Next, I use an impressor. It's an embosser. It's a rolling ball type of embosser. If you don't have this, you can use a bone folder to curl the edges. It's just easier for me to use the impressor embosser, and I've had this, and I just use my tools that I have. Next, I attach my flowers to the leaves using a little bit of glue. I attach my butterfly. I kind of try to evenly space the flowers around the leaves. I do concentrate on the center where they all met, because you kind of want a flower on top of that so you don't really see that they're individual leaves and branches attached. This way they look at all like one vine growing up the lattice. Next, I use my scrap of Whisperite paper, Perfect Plum ink, and teeny tiny wishes. I punch out with my word window punch, and I scrap of Blushing Bride with my modern label punch. I love that punch, even though it's retired. I do trim off the corner of the modern label so it'll fit on the card, and I had to move that butterfly over. It wasn't sitting correctly. Last thing is I attach the pearls to the card front. Using my paper snips is the key. The paper snips can easily go underneath those pearl and underneath the glue that's attached to that pearl. You can pick up the pearl using the paper snips and move it over to your item that you want to attach it to. Thank you again for watching. This is Karen Squires, Stampin' Up! Independent Demonstrator with Stampin' by the Bay. Thanks again.